Right, welcome to the second set of lectures in this series on the politics of the environment or environmental policy making. Just to remind you, the reading list is available. Again, try and dip into some of the readings. They will help you to get more depth, get better understanding of some of the topics I'll be discussing in these 3 weeks of environmental politics lectures. But again, if you have any inclination or ambition to get a really high mark in the end of the module exam, and this material will be appearing on the end of the module exam. So as I said before, for the end of the module exam, because the elections assignment takes up a third of the module, because the elections assignment is worth a third of the module marks, basically there's no need for me or no reason for me to also throw in an exam question on that first section of the module, which took 5 weeks effectively, on geography and elections. So the exam questions will be solely based on sections B and C of the module, and we're in the middle of we're slap bang now in the middle of section B with this week's set of lectures. So this is important material for the exams. The readings will, if you can draw in some good, clever insights, relevant insights from reading material as part of your exam answer, you're going to get extra marks for that. But on the other hand, if you don't draw in insights from readings, then you're not going to be in that first class honours category, because that's one of the expectations we have when we're giving first class honours for exam answers, that there's some evidence of engagement with readings. In any case, you're in the second year of your university degree now, so this should be this is what you should be doing as a matter of course in any case. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about environmental policy itself. So the last set of lectures we're looking at the environmental movement, environmental groups. Today I'm going to look more specifically at environmental policy and the issues or difficulties that are faced when drawing up environmental policy. So policy making in relation to different environmental issues takes place at a range of geographical scales. And there can be obviously scope for conflict between all these different levels. So at the biggest level is the global level. We'll talk about the Kyoto Protocol in next week's lectures, probably very briefly, but I will mention it. I'll talk about global climate change politics in passing. But there is a global level. The European Union level is very important for Ireland, because quite a number of Ireland's environmental policies are policies that have already been drawn up at the European Union level and ultimately are just simply transposed or passed into Irish law. The national level is important because obviously, especially the Department of Environment in terms of the national level, because that should be really the driver of environmental policy in the Republic of Ireland and the driver of improvements in terms of environmental quality. The national level sort of sits between the European Union level and the local level, because on the one hand, as I said there a minute ago, a lot of the laws or policies that are passed in Ireland are ultimately laws and policies and frameworks that are basically drawn from the European Union. They're basically laws, policies and frameworks that Ireland has to impose or put into law because of our membership of the European Union. On the other hand, we've got the local level, and the local level is important because a lot of the actual implementation of environmental policy is taking place at the local level. County councils and city councils have a lot of responsibility in terms of implementing specific or certain environmental policies. The last point to note on this slide is there can be a gap between the actual policy and what actually takes place on the ground, what actually happens. So this is what's called the implementation deficit. So implementation means putting policies into practice. And if there is an implementation deficit, it means there's a gap between what a policy has tried to achieve and what actually takes place. Now, policymaking is a difficult issue, as I'm sure you're aware, but environmental policymaking is even more difficult because a lot of environmental issues are quite complex and difficult to resolve. And this was probably more the case, say, 20 years ago, but even today, a lot of the people who are actually drawing up policy sometimes don't fully grasp just why environmental issues require special treatment, why they need to be treated differently to other potential policy issues. Limits in terms of policy making are placed by what's called the traditional policy paradigm and the nature of government ministries and departments. So basically, the old style of doing politics, where everything is effectively, where government is effectively divided into 15 or so different government departments, and all these different departments operate almost in isolation of each other to a large degree. That doesn't work for the environment because obviously environmental issues are a concern for the Department of Environment, but a lot of these issues are going to be impacted by policy decisions that are made by other departments, as I'll come back to later on. Governments themselves generally will tend to prioritize economic issues over the environment. So the general focus will be on a stable economic environment over the environment. Stable economic environment over the actual environment. Sort of confusing there, sorry about that. The next point is a point that probably links directly back to the previous point, the need for integration of policy, the need for different departments to be buying in and taking action on specific environmental issues in order for effective environmental policy. The last point on this slide is the idea that you can have opportunity spaces, the idea that there can be certain windows open that allow for more ambitious environmental policies to be brought in. And we'll see that again and again. We'll definitely see that when we talk about the issue attention cycle. So this idea that there can be a certain period where there is an opening there to allow for more effective environmental policies or more effective environmental action. Sometimes it's an election. Sometimes politicians may be more willing to promise things at an election. Sometimes it's just because society changes. And I'll talk about this with the issue of attention cycle, that sometimes the level of interest or urgency amongst the general public on environmental issues such as climate change, sometimes that will reach a peak. And it happened in 2019, for instance, with the climate strikes and so on. And that can lead to a greater impetus for environmental action. Other times, you may not have these opportunity spaces and there's not a lot happening in terms of policy. Now, legal issues on the environment. The Irish Constitution enshrines the rights of property owners, but there's no reference to environmental rights in the Irish Constitution. The person who is ultimately responsible for enforcing and drawing up and enforcing policy issues on the environment is the Minister for Environment. But the Minister themselves may be limited by the actions taken by previous ministers. In some cases, the actions taken by previous ministers for the environment, literally as they were just about heading out the door, literally as they were going out of office. The responsibility for putting policy into practice, as I said in the previous slide, often lies in the hands of county councils and city councils. So implementation, by and large, a lot of the responsibility for that is actually taken up by the county councils and the city councils. Europe is a significant avenue of redress. So if there are issues with the environment, given the fact that there are so many European Union directives on the environment, you can take court cases on the environment to the European Court of Justice or the European Court. But this has limitations. If you take a case on the environment, it's going to take a long time, and any decisions by the court can mainly be of the form, all right, yeah, you've got a point there, we're going to ask the government to do better on this, and the government say, we'll do better on this, and nothing much happens. So it has its limitations. Okay, we're now going to move on to 8 characteristics of environmental policy making. The first thing to note is that environmental policy making often involves actions or policies relating to what's called public goods. So public goods are goods that are freely available. So that's the air is freely available, water freely available, common lands such as say Stephen's Green, land that is say the Phoenix Park or the Heath in County Laois, land that's open for anyone to use and access. That's another public good. But if you overuse and abuse these public goods, that can cause environmental problems. So a lot of environmental policy making deals with public goods such as air, water, and so on, and requires action to be taken. The problem is everyone has access to these public goods, and everyone can have adverse impacts on these public goods. You can have what's called collective action problems involved here, where you're requiring basically a large number of people to take action, but not everyone takes action. And in some cases, when people are looking around and they're seeing other people not taking action, then the impetus or the level of encouragement for them to do the right thing starts to decline. Because there's so many people involved, there's also the temptation to free ride, to say, well, with 5 million people in Ireland, we've been asked to do X and Y for the environment, but I'm just one person, I'm not going to have any impact. So I think I'm going to assume everyone else is going to do the right thing, and if I just carry on as normal, I don't think that's going to have any impact at all. Now, if that is just one person out of 5 million, that's okay. The problem is that might well be 2 or 3 million out of 5 million does that. And because of this temptation to free ride, you might find that nothing really happens here. The next point on the environment, transboundary problems. A number of environmental issues cross political borders. So obviously climate change is a global issue. But like we can look at, say, river pollution, a river that passes through a number of countries. That's going to involve transboundary problems. Acid rain is another transboundary problem. So in some cases, environmental issues or problems may arise, and the cause of these problems could be caused by something happening in an entirely different country. So because of this transboundary nature of environmental issues and environmental problems, there is a need for international cooperation to resolve this. If Germany is having problems with acid rain destroying its forests, Germany itself can't resolve that. It's got to rely on other countries that may be causing the problem to also take action. If there's river pollution in, say, affecting the River Rhine in the Netherlands, the Dutch can't resolve that problem on their own. They're going to require countries like Germany and Switzerland to try and improve their environmental quality standards further upstream. Complexity and uncertainty is the third characteristic we're going to look at this, and this reflects the point that there is a degree of scientific uncertainty about certain issues or aspects relating to environmental problems. So we don't 100% know the full science of certain environmental problems. What's the main causes, or what's going to happen if we don't take action, or what's going to happen if we take this action. So there is still a certain degree of scientific uncertainty about certain environmental issues, environmental problems. And that can be a problem, because if the scientists themselves are having some degree of doubt about environmental issues, what can you expect if you've got, say, a 65, 63 or 64-year-old head of the Department of Environment? What are they going to do on the issue? They may be someone who's just in the job because they got a transfer from another department. They don't really know that much about the environment, and they are there having to advise the minister on what to do about this problem, and it just makes things difficult. The other issue with environmental issues is some of them are what's called non-reducible problems, and that means that efforts to try and resolve one environmental issue can have a knock-on effect on other environmental issues. You might do take some action to resolve one environmental problem, but that can have unforeseen consequences in relation to causing another issue or problem, or making another environmental issue or problem worse. So the classic example of this, urban air problems in, say, parts of Ireland and the United Kingdom. We can look at, say, the London smogs in the 1950s. The technological fix that was brought in to resolve these smogs was to require industries to build taller chimney stacks to ensure that the pollution from their industries got blown up into the atmosphere and got blown further away. So the decision to build taller chimney stacks was successful in reducing local air pollution in cities like London. The problem was, what goes up has to come down. And what happened with this pollution was it got blown up into the atmosphere, got mixed up in the atmosphere, mixed up with moisture in the atmosphere, and ultimately came back down to Earth hundreds of kilometers away in the form of acid rain. So these tall chimney stacks solved the problem of local air pollution, but caused a new problem in terms of acid rain, which wasn't impacting the place where the pollution came from, but it was impacting on other places that were hundreds of kilometers away, such as, say, the Black Forest in Germany. Irreversibility. Some environmental issues, if they're not resolved quickly, may have irreversible consequences. You may not be able to turn back the clock. You may not, and that could be a case with climate change, for instance. It's definitely a case if you're talking about the extinction of species. Once a species becomes extinct, that's it. You can't turn back the clock. If you don't take action, the consequence, or if you take the wrong action, the consequences may be effectively terminal. It's too late to take action. So there is greater pressure to get things right with environmental policies. And sometimes this pressure may lead people to actually take the opposite approach and say, oh, I don't want to do the wrong thing, so I think I'll just wait until we'll get more research, we'll need more research, we'll just wait until we can get the right policy. But ultimately, if you're waiting for the right policy too long, nothing ever happens. Next point then, temporal and spatial variability. The idea that there's winners and losers because of taking certain environmental policies, but there can be winners and losers if you don't devise environmental policy. And this can have a geographical dimension, but it can also have a temporal or historical dimension. So anytime a new policy comes in, there's going to be winners and losers. The most obvious example of this is decisions on where to build new waste management infrastructure. So if you're, say, in the Midlands and a decision is made, we're going to close down landfill sites and we're going to build incinerators instead. If you're someone living near the old landfill site, then you're a winner. That landfill site is going to be closed down and all the environmental issues associated with that will obviously decline over time. On the other hand, if you're someone who's going to be living in an area close to where a new waste management incinerator is going to be built, then you're going to feel that you're a loser. So policies there can be winners and losers. Climate change policies, there's going to be winners and losers. If a decision is made to, say, increase the carbon tax, increase the price of fuel, that's going to have more effect on people who are traveling longer distances to work than those who may be living in the city and can easily access public transport. So there is that geographical dimension. A lot of times there's a general sense as well that certain environmental policies tend to impact on, say, rural areas more than urban areas. And this can lead to resentment. And resentment can be problematic because this can lead to growing levels of anti-environmentalism. So this winners and losers dimension in terms of the geographical dimension is quite significant. The other dimension is the temporal dimension. The idea that if you take the right decision now, it's going to have very positive effects for future generations. If you don't take the right decision now, if you don't take a decision at all, it's going to have very negative impacts for future generations. And again, climate change is the obvious example here. Lack of action on climate change now may not adversely affect people in the current day too much, but it's going to have a lot more impacts on those who may be around 40 or 50 years later. Now, the last 2 points here, last 2 characteristics. First of them, I'm going to talk about regulatory intervention. The idea that you need to have government intervention. A lot of the actions that cause environmental harm are themselves legitimate activities. Driving to work is a legitimate activity. Industry is a legitimate activity. Farming is a legitimate activity. Domestic heating is a legitimate activity. A lot of the actions that cause environmental harm, they're not out and out criminal activities, but a lot of them are legitimate everyday activities. Now, if these activities are getting to such a point that they're causing very serious environmental harm, governments then have to intervene. And this is where we talk about regulatory intervention. But when drawing up the regulations, there's always going to be a tension between the need to kind of limit environmental harm, but also the need to continue promoting economic development, promoting economic growth. The last of our characteristics of environmental policy making is one I've already referred to: administrative fragmentation. Now, I haven't used this term before, but I'll use it now. I've talked about this idea quickly a few slides back. So administrative fragmentation reflects the fact that departments of government are broken up. Government is broken up into different ministries or different government departments. And by and large, a lot of these departments, once you have a new minister appointed, they go into the department, and the departments often act as if they're in isolation of other departments. So they almost act as if they're separate kingdoms. And they basically see their topic or their issue as their big issue, and they resent any they will have a resentment towards what they see as any form of interference in their department's activity from other government departments. Now, this is a problem for the environment because environmental issues crisscross a number of different government departments. Take climate change as an issue. The Department for Environment can't do everything on climate change because a lot of the policy issues really are issues that have resonance with other government departments. So if you really want effective government action on climate change, you need buy-in not just from the Department of Environment, but you need buy-in from other government departments as well. You need the Department of Agriculture on board, you need the Department of Enterprise on board, the Department of Energy on board, the Department of Transport on board, and as I said last week, the most important or the most influential of the government departments outside that, the Department of the Taoiseach, the Department of Finance. You need them on board as well. So that is a problem. If government departments decide, no, we're the Department of Enterprise, we decide what happens in relation to business and employment, and if if we see the Minister for Environment asking us to be doing certain things, we'll tell them to just get lost. They need to look after their department, and in our minds, their department's less important than our department anyway. So you can get this administrative fragmentation messing things up in terms of environmental policy, because you need an integration of environmental policy across all government departments because of the nature of environmental issues. They're interconnected and they crisscross different departments. You can get this administrative fragmentation, try saying that 10 times fast. You can get this operating at a number of scales. You also see this operating at the European Union level because there are departments or directorates at the European Union level. So you can see this operating at the European Union level. It obviously operates at the national level. In some cases, it might also operate at the local or regional level. Now, policy instruments. So they're the characteristics of environmental policy. What are the best measures to use to resolve environmental issues? Different environmental issues may require different types of solutions or policy mechanisms to resolve them. So there's 3 different groups of mechanisms you can use to resolve environmental policies, or to resolve not the environmental policies, to implement environmental policies, but also to resolve environmental problems. Economic mechanisms. This group is generally these are generally used if you want to bring about change pretty quickly. Ultimately, you're trying to provide a financial incentive to polluters to improve their behavior, to reduce polluting activities, or you're providing them with a financial sanction as alternately. So there's different mechanisms. Green taxes, sometimes referred to as price-based mechanisms. The carbon tax is an example of this. Green taxes, this is where you're putting an extra level of tax on polluting activity. So the carbon tax is an example of that. It's where you're putting an additional level of tax on activities that lead to more and more carbon dioxide being pumped into the atmosphere. And this, in turn, has an effect in terms of increasing petrol prices, increasing energy prices, and so on. The big idea behind the carbon tax is, ideally, you're thinking, if we increase the tax, then people will have more of a disincentive to maybe make use of their cars. So the idea behind this is that it might encourage people to use their cars less. Doesn't really happen too well given the nature of how Ireland's transport system operates, however. The other type of economic mechanism refers to rights-based approaches. So these are quotas and permits. So the idea here is, and this refers more to individual industries. So here you're trying to bring down pollution levels from industries. So you give every industry a certain level of quotas in terms of pollution, or they have certain permits. And the idea is that there's also the chance to trade these. So if an industry is given permission or a quota for a certain level of pollution, but they actually do better, they actually reduce their pollution levels below the level that they've been allowed to pollute at, there is a tradable dimension. They can then sell their excess quota to other industries. So the idea here is the economic mechanism can actually encourage industries to do better than the targets that have been set. So if you're an industry, you know there's financial incentives to reduce your pollution because you can sell your excess quota to other industries and make money out of it. Voluntary approaches, then, this is where you just simply try to change behavior by education or negotiation, so advertising campaigns and so on. Ideally, it's a cheap enough mechanism to use, and ideally it's probably the best mechanism because the best way of bringing about change is getting people to change their attitudes. The problem with this is it takes a lot of time, and you're not always guaranteed the voluntary approaches will work. The last set of policy instruments are straightforward regulation enforcement. So where you set a standard and you enforce that standard. So command and control, and it involves the use of legislation. In some cases, you may have requirements that are based around the best available technology or the best available technology not entailing excessive costs. So there may be certain allowances here with the regulation. One of the problems with regulation is that if you want to enforce it, you need to be gathering a lot of data. So regulation and enforcement, it requires a lot of data to be gathered. It requires a lot of people to be employed to gather that data. So the enforcement of the legislation can actually cost a lot in terms of the number of people involved in gathering data, in ensuring that standards are being maintained, and the amount of money you need to spend on other things such as technology and so on. In some cases, especially in cases where the responsibility for implementation falls into the hands of local authorities, in some cases the local authorities may say, look, you're asking us to do this. We don't have the money or the people available to do this. So we'll do something, but we can't do everything. We can't do all the things you want. In some cases, the way that regulators may go about trying to enforce legislation may require them to actually work hand in hand with the industries themselves or the polluters. So the general thinking is, okay, we can't mind or watch everything that a specific industry is doing. So the best way to do this is actually work with industries and ask them to help us when we're trying to gather the data. And this can sort of lead to very cozy relationships emerging between the regulators and the polluters. In some cases, the regulator could be captured by those that they're regulating. Now, which mechanisms are the best to use? There's different ways different criteria that you can use to evaluate the effectiveness or the usefulness of policy. And all these different criteria tend to favor one policy mechanism over another. So effectiveness, which form is the quickest to produce a response? Voluntary mechanisms will take a long time. Economic mechanisms or regulation may bring about a quicker response. Motivation, which form provides motivation for even further environmental improvements? So economic approaches, we talked about the tradable quotas, there's scope there, but green taxes may not do the job for you, because green taxes are just, people are just maybe soak up the green tax and just give out about it. Regulation may not do the job for you, because industries might say, okay, there's a standard we've been asked to aim for, we'll just hit that standard, and there's no real motivation on us to do any better. Obviously, voluntary mechanisms are all about motivation, so they're probably the best mechanisms to use in relation to this particular criteria. Administrative costs, which mechanisms required the largest cost in terms of administering them? Voluntary mechanisms are fairly cheap. Regulation and enforcement may require a lot of administrative activity and a lot of administration expenses. Efficiency, which mechanism can maximize effectiveness but also minimize costs? And in some ways that's quite complex. In some ways the most effective mechanisms may be the ones that require the biggest expense in terms of administration expenses and so on. Political acceptability, will a policy mechanism or approach, will it be accepted by the general public? Will that policy be accepted by the general public? And last of all, distribution impact, the idea that policy mechanisms should not have a greater adverse effect on the poor. This can be a problem with, say, something like a green tax, which is meant to apply the same everywhere. So a green tax, say an extra 5 cents on a litre of petrol, may not have that much of an impact on a wealthy person living in Dublin. They may use the Luce to get to work every day in any case. They may not need to use their cars that much. A poor person living in rural Ireland who needs to use the car every day to drive to Dublin, that green tax is going to have a bigger impact or effect on them. So yeah, so these are a number of criteria you can think about when you're evaluating environmental policy or different policy mechanisms. Now, the last part of today's this lecture, these lectures, which are meant to cover the Monday lecture and the Tuesday lecture, the last half of these, I'm going to talk about barriers to effective policy making. And there's four different barriers I'm going to talk about. I'm going to focus on 3 of these today. I'll talk about the last barrier next week when I'm looking at climate change as a case study. So the first of these barriers that we can talk about is the issue attention cycle. And this shows how environmental issues become politicized, how they get taken up by the media and as a result, and the general public, and later on get taken up by the politicians. The issue attention cycle highlights the importance of public opinion in liberal democracies such as those in the Western world. The model was first drawn up in the early 1970s to model and explain the rise and fall of environmentalism in the United States of America in the early 1970s. So people were wondering why there was a period where there was a lot of interest in the environment, where people were calling for action in the late 60s, early 70s. And then suddenly there was there was a loss of interest, a loss of focus on the environment a few years later, especially around the time of the global oil crisis in 1974. So the big idea about the issue attention cycle is to highlight the fact that environmental issues go through different cycles of attention. There's going to be certain periods where there's a lot of interest, a lot of focus on a certain environmental problem. There's going to be other points in time where people lose interest in that issue or that problem. So this is the issue attention cycle itself. So the first stage in the cycle is the pre-problem stage. This is the stage before this is the stage before the general public becomes aware of the issue or the problem. At this stage, maybe only a handful of scientists or boffins know about the problem. So the scientific community may have awareness of the issue, they may be concerned about the issue, but generally, very few people in the general public know about this issue. Stage 2 then, alarm discovery, euphoric enthusiasm. This is a point in time where something happens, all of a sudden, where this issue something happens to make this issue big news. The media takes up the issue. The issue becomes front page news for a certain period of time. So the media become aware of the issue, and as a result, the public becomes aware of the issue. And they're scared by the issue, but there's this sense of enthusiasm, the sense that, okay, we know about this issue now, we know something needs to be done, we think something will be done, so there is a certain level of enthusiasm. There's a lot of, at this stage 2 of the cycle, there's a lot of focus on the issue, a lot of media coverage, the public are asking for action, and the politicians are starting to talk about taking action as well. So there is a general sense that this is a serious issue, but there is also a sense that, look, something's going to be done. We're going to take some action on the issue. You move on then to stage 3, realizing cost of significant progress. So this is a stage where the enthusiasm starts to get a bit tampered down. This is a stage where you start to realize, okay, this is what we actually have to do to resolve this issue. It's not going to be simple. So the public wanted action on the issue, but then the public might be told, okay, you've got to do something. You really should be using your cars less. Or you will need to spend twice as much as normal on domestic heating. So people suddenly realize resolving this issue isn't going to be as simple as they thought. It's going to require action. It's going to require hard action. And some of that hard action may need to be done by themselves. And the political community start to realize, okay, if we have to bring in these policies, if we have to bring in the policies needed to resolve this issue, they're not going to be very popular. So we move on to stage 4, a decline of intense public interest. This is where the public start to lose interest in this issue. The politicians may have done something to put this issue on the long finger. Remember last week I talked about non-decision making. So the politicians may have decided, look, we're going to do something on this issue, but we won't do it now. We need more information. We need more science. So the politicians may have used non-decision mechanisms to try and put this issue on the long finger. The public are starting to lose interest because they're going, oh yeah, we're worried about this issue. We're worried about this problem, this environmental problem, but do we really want to spend a couple of thousand more on petrol or energy costs? No, we don't like that. So the media, the public and the politicians start to lose interest in this issue. It falls off the top of the media's radar. The media has moved on to other more sexy issues by this stage. The media has lost interest in this issue. If it gets any coverage at all, it might be a few lines in the middle of a column on page 25 of the newspaper. The public's lost interest. Some of the public have forgotten about this issue now because it's no longer being focused on by the media, and the politicians are happy to let this issue go on the long finger. So we move to the post-problem phase stage, where basically people have forgotten about this issue. Now the thing about the cycle is it's a cycle. Things move up and down the cycle. So an issue can move off the public's radar, then something happens to push this issue back to the media's attention again and the public's attention again. So issues can move from stage 5 of the cycle back to stage 2 again and work their way back down to stages 3, 4, and 5. So it is a cycle. So there are positive mentions. Anytime an issue gets moved back to the top of the cycle, back to stage 2, there's going to be calls for action. And sometimes the government will do something. So actions that the government takes the first time an issue moves to stage 2 of the cycle can help them the next time this issue moves to stage 2 of the cycle. So say the first time the issue is at stage 2, the government says, we need more research on this. The next time this issue gets propelled back to stage 2 in the cycle, the government's actually now got all this research that they can use to say, okay, we probably need to set in place a body to monitor this. And the next time this issue comes back to stage 2, this body, this monitoring body, or this expert body is already in place, and they're there to give the government concrete proposals on what actions to take. The negative dimension is it just shows how the public opinion is so important for policy making and environmental policy making, but the public's interest levels are fickle. Changes in public opinion can problematize policy making, and politicians know this. So politicians sometimes can, if they don't want to take an action, they can just say, okay, the public want action on this environmental issue, but if we just dig our heels in and bide our time, eventually the public's going to lose interest. The cycle is often strongly related to the state of the economy. If the economy is doing well, an issue can remain at stage 2 of the cycle for a longer period of time. If an economy is in a recession, however, issues move right back down to the bottom of the cycle very quickly, because there's just not the level of because economies are doing poorly, the public's motivation and politicians' motivation for taking action on the environment tends to be much lower than would be the case if an economy is doing well or if the economy is strong. A sudden crisis can also have an impact in relation to the issue attention cycle, and sometimes a sudden crisis may have an impact even if it's not related to that issue at all. So the tsunamis in South Asia, even though they're related to earthquakes, the tsunamis in South Asia propelled climate change back to the top of the issue attention cycle because there was this mistaken link between the tsunamis and climate change. So our case study we're going to use to explain how the issue attention cycle works is the Dublin smogs of the 1980s. What is a smog? A smog is a smoky fog. A smog is effectively a period of prolonged high levels of air pollution that occur over a period of time, usually in certain weather conditions, usually in very dry, cold winters, where smoke gets mixed up with fog, and you get this very high levels of air pollution occurring over a period of time. What we sometimes refer to as air pollution episodes. We had a number of major air pollution episodes in the Western world during the 20th century. In this part of the world, the most famous example of this was the London smogs of 1952, which were estimated to have caused 4,000 deaths over that period in 1952. We had a number of smogs in Dublin in the 1980s. There was a reason for this. There was an economic reason for this. Again, remember what I was talking about last week, the economic recession in Ireland in the 1970s and 1980s. This was a big driver. The big increase in oil prices that occurred after the global oil crisis of 1974 encouraged the Irish government to decide, okay, oil is too costly now, coal is cheap, turf is cheap, we need to encourage people to move away from oil and use cheaper coal and cheaper turf more, because then it'll cost them less to heat their houses. This occurred over the late 1970s, early 1980s. And it got to such a point, this shift to coal, particularly in Dublin, got to such a point that the coal market in Dublin by the 1980s was seen to be as large as that of the London coal market. And it led to the creation of a very strong lobbying group for the coal industry, a very strong coal cartel called Coal Distributors Limited. And this became a very significant insider group in terms of a lot of what happened in the 1980s on air pollution, the air pollution issue. Air pollution became a big media issue and a big issue for the public in the early 1980s, where we had a number of serious smogs in parts of Dublin in the early 1980s. A very high level, for instance, measured in Ballyfermot. This would be about 6 or 7 times the level, the level 6 or 7 times the level that the European Union would deem safe for air pollution. So we got serious smogs in Dublin in the early 1980s. That very high level in Ballyfermot, for instance, which led to increased levels of morbidity and mortality. And levels breached the levels that were underpinned in the European Community's directive on air pollution, which sets certain values, limit values for smoke pollution and sulfur dioxide pollution for all European Union states. Now, the smogs occurred at a period of time where you had a number of very cold winters in the early 1980s. And the smogs, while the smogs were taking place, the public's attention was focused on the issue of air pollution. The media's attention was focused on the issue of air pollution. And the politicians were also being encouraged to do something about air pollution. Then all of a sudden, the weather sort of changed in the mid-1980s. And again, I'm old enough to remember this. The weather got a lot wetter and a lot windier. And you didn't really have too many cold winters in the mid-1980s. So because there was you had wetter, windier conditions, you didn't have the conditions for smogs to form. So because there was no smogs, people were no longer focused on the issue of air pollution. The media was no longer focused on the issue of air pollution. So the issue started to drift off the media's attention and off the political agenda. One of the things that had been encouraged, that the government had been encouraged to do in the early 1980s as a result of those smogs in the early 1980s was to draw up an Air Pollution Act or Air Pollution Bill. this didn't really come into effect until 1987 because the progress of the bill was frequently delayed. And the fact that you had those mild winters in 1985 and 1986 didn't really increase the impetus on the government to get the bill over the line. By the mid-1980s, the coal cartel, Coal Distributors Limited, was suggesting that, look, it's not really an issue, guys. Come on, come on. It was a once-off. Don't worry about it. It's not an issue anymore. This issue is being propelled on the political agenda set by irresponsible academics like John Sweeney in the Minute Geography Department, and they've just kind of blown this out of proportion. The Coal Distributors Limited, over this point in time, as an insider group, were actively lobbying against any actions that were being taken that they would see as cutting into their markets. So, for instance, in 1988, there was a proposal to make a small part of Ballyfermot a special control area. So they said, we'll make this small area of Ballyfermot a control area. We'll ban the use of coal in this area. We'll see what happens. And this was objected to by Coal Distributors Limited, a group that, as I said, had a lot of financial clout at that point in time. Now, what happened again? Think about the issue attention cycle. What happened in the late 1980s? The weather changed again. All of a sudden, we had, once again, a number of winters with a lot of dry, cold spells of weather. And once again, you had the conditions required. You had the necessary conditions. You had the necessary conditions to allow for the creation of smogs. So we had a number of smogs again in Dublin in the late 1980s that reached a peak level of 1,716 micrograms per cubic metre. The peak level at this period was measured in Crumlin on the 25th of November 1988. I actually was in Crumlin that day. You couldn't literally see. I went outside out of a sense of madness, and you literally couldn't see about maybe as far as a metre ahead of you or 2 metres ahead of you. It was bad. The level was 7 times that recommended by the European Union for the protection of human health. And again, suddenly the smogs were once again, a major focus for the public. There were once again front page news, and you had once again public outrage and calls for radical action to be taken. So what actually happened? Well, the issue had gone through the issue attention cycle in the early 1980s, and one of the knock-on effects of that was that you had this Air Pollution Act. The government had put in place legislation on air pollution because of the calls for action the first time this issue went through. The next time the issue went through, the government decided that they were going to take even more action on the issue on smoke pollution. And they brought in a number of measures. The key measure that was brought in on the 1st of October 1990, a decision to ban the sale of smoky or bituminous coal within the Greater Dublin area. This was an initiative of Mary Harney, who was the junior minister at the Department of Government, and she was based in Dublin herself. The senior minister, Pádraig Flynn, didn't really see this as an issue. He was a rural politician from Mayo. He said, look, blow over, don't worry. But Mary Harney was the person who really drove action on bringing in this ban on the sale of smoky coal. And she was ultimately supported in the end by the Taoiseach of the time, Charles Haughey, who was himself also someone who came from Dublin. The key thing there is that she had the Taoiseach support. If she had been pushing this on her own, this wouldn't have happened. Now, this really had a very significant effect on bringing an end to the Dublin smogs of the 1980s. Other things were also happening as well at this point in time. A lot of people in Dublin were themselves making the decision to move away from coal. They were realizing, look, look what we're getting with coal. We're getting smogs. We need to try and see, can we use other forms of energy for heating. So smoke emissions were starting to fall because of community action in relation to smogs, and because natural gas was now starting to come online, which meant a lot of people could now change from smoke smoky coal to natural gas in any case, without entailing a lot of excessive costs. So the situation was transformed and emission levels fell dramatically. As John Sweeney said, it was an indication of how a small nation may galvanise itself to begin to solve its environmental problems once community sensitisation begins and the political will to grasp the nettle exists. New problems today relate probably more with vehicle pollution as opposed to domestic heat pollution. One of the issues with vehicle pollution is probably the lack of adequate monitoring of this. So that's the issue attention cycle. The next of our barriers we're going to look at quickly is collective action problems. Collective action problems occurs when you have a large number of people, when you require a large number of people to take collective action on an issue. Where you have a lot of people involved, there's going to be difficulties in terms of agreeing on a common course of action. Because when you have a large number of different actors involved, they'll all have different agendas and they'll all want different things. So cooperation gets harder and harder when more and more people are involved. And when you've got an issue that involves all the people of the world, like climate change, you can see why that could be a classic collective action problem. Cooperation can be sometimes, ironically, the hardest to achieve when people have the most to lose out, because when people have the most to lose out if no action is taken, but especially when you've got these large number of different actors involved. The problem is when people are looking at things on an individual basis, what makes sense for them individually may not make sense for the general well-being of the common public. So you get a form of what's called collective irrationality. Collective irrationality occurs where actions that make a lot of sense are totally rational from a person's economic self-interest. When all these actions are added up, they cause adverse environmental effects and cause adverse environmental harm. And the classic example of this is Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. So he talks about this common land where everyone has everyone's free to use the common land and everyone puts 10 cows each on the common land. Then one of the farmers looks around and says, well, I think I'll actually put an extra cow in this common land. And all the older farmers look at him and say, oh, he's now got 11 cows. We're going to put one cow. We're going to add another cow to this common land as a result, because if he's doing it, why can't we do it? Then someone else adds another cow and everyone else responds. And this keeps going and going until the land becomes overgrazed, and ultimately this common land that was freely available to everyone, it gets destroyed. You have soil erosion and it's no use to anyone. And now no one can use the land. So this is the tragedy of the commons. And this is basically the point we make in relation to collective irrationality. The classic example of a collective action problem is, of course, climate change, because there's so many different actors involved. Even if you look at governments, there's 200 governments around the world. Even getting agreements between 200 governments, as I'll explain next week, even getting agreements at the governmental level, they're very hard to achieve. The last of the barriers I'm going to talk about today is the barrier of complexity, or bounded rationality. So on the one hand, you have complex environmental issues. On the other hand, the level of competence, or the level of scope that government bodies have in relation to addressing environmental issues, that level is also restricted. So you have this conflict between complex environmental issues and the limited capacities amongst governments and government departments to be able to address these complex issues. So the policy-making progress is always dogged by uncertainty. A lot of environmental problems, as I said already, a number of environmental problems still have a high level of scientific uncertainty associated with them, which makes the policy-making process even harder, because you're trying to make policies and you're not fully certain what will be the impacts of those policies. Even the scientists aren't fully certain what the impacts of those policies will be. So policy-making as a process becomes harder when you've got these levels of uncertainty. Generally, the types of policies that governments like, that government departments like, that civil servants like, are technical fixes. Some kind of plaster that you can just put over the issue and hopefully it'll go away. Maybe some change in technology or something like that, a technical fix. The temptation amongst governments when you're faced with uncertainty is to opt for reactive policies or reactive approaches to environmental policy. A reactive approach to environmental policy basically is where you only take action on an environmental policy when you reach a point in time where you actually have to take that policy. Otherwise, don't do anything up to that point. So a reactive policy. Oh, there's a sudden crisis, we need to do something now, so we'll bring in the policy. As I said already, governments love approaches where they can use a technical fix, where they can just kind of bring in some change to technology. So maybe changing the way the cars are produced to reduce car pollution and so on. Technical fixes are the ideal mechanisms or approaches that governments like to use. The decision makers, governments themselves, operate with bounded rationality. So there's limited capacities, there's limited knowledge within government departments. They're not all scientists. The way the government departments are set up doesn't really help things. As I said before, we do have administrative fragmentation as an issue. Environmental issues need to be resolved with all government departments working hand in hand. But by and large, government departments don't work hand in hand and definitely don't work hand in hand on environmental issues because they say, look, the environment is the Minister for Environment's concern. Why should we have to take action on environmental issues? Why should we be changing our policies because the Minister for Environment is asking us to do so? That's their area. We don't want them interfering in our area. So environmental problems are generally defined within existing political arrangements. And the existing political arrangements are basically where you have governments divided into 15 different departments. As I said, different departments take charge of their own topic and they almost act as separate kingdoms, isolated from the other departments. So the Minister for Agriculture, for them, we're in charge of agriculture. We make the decisions in agriculture, obviously in consultation with the Taoiseach, and we don't want other departments interfering in our department issues. We don't want other departments interfering in relation to agriculture. We don't want to have the Minister of Environment knocking on our door saying we need to take action on emissions from agriculture because, look, this is our department. We'll make the decisions. We're definitely not going to be dictated to by the Minister for the Environment because as far as we're concerned, we're a more important or influential department in any case. So all the problems are defined within existing political arrangements. The problem is environmental problems require different responses. Government departments have a set way of trying to deal with issues, a set way of trying to deal with problems, which often work for other policy areas such as, say, social welfare or, say, taxation. But environmental issues don't work that way. Environmental issues require different departments working together because you have this interconnected nature of environmental problems. A number of environmental problems won't be resolved by just the Minister for Environment or just the Department for Environment. A number of environmental issues require other government departments to work hand in hand with the Department for Environment. So there's a need with environmental issues for more creative, imaginative responses, but more importantly, more coordinated responses. Different government departments working hand in hand to resolve specific environmental issues. Now, here's a recent list of government departments. This is a bit just to show you how governments operate. So they're all the different government departments as of this was 28. So this was the previous government, the 20. This was one of, no, it wasn't even the previous government. This is one of the most recent governments, but you can just see, here's all the different, there's 18 different government departments. Now, two of these departments actually joined up together. So if you look there, you're trying to find where's the Minister for Environment. So we have a Department of Environment, Climate and Communication, and we have a Department of Transport. I'll just note those two there. So if you look at the Department of Environment, it's one of 18 different departments there. It's concerned with climate, but it also has, the Minister for Environment also had to look at communications as well. So there was another important policy area also added to that department, which actually was an extra level of work for the Minister for Environment. When Eamon Ryan was the Minister for Environment between 2020 and 2024, he was the head of that department, but he also was the head of the Department for Transport. So if you look at, say, the actual individual Department of Environment, the Minister for Environment has a lot of different areas to focus on. And some of these are not purely to do with the department. So it's a big department with a lot of issues. So that's one thing to know as well, that government departments often have a lot of things to do in and of themselves. So you have a lot of work on your own hands with your own department issues. And maybe it's a bit even harder then to try and go to other departments saying, look, can we work together on a common policy on, say, relation to reducing carbon emissions and so on. Now, just to make the point on limited capacities amongst government decision makers, this was definitely an issue in the 1990s and early 2000s. Maybe less so today because a lot of policymakers have at least had some, a lot of policymakers in the 2020s will have had at least some degree of exposure to scientific training as part of their education. But this was definitely an issue in the 1980s, 1990s, and even the early 2000s. And this reflects the lack of environmental studies in Irish education up until probably the 1970s. So environmental studies was part of the Irish education curriculum in the 1920s. In the 1930s, Eamon de Valera became Taoiseach, and he decided he was going to put a lot more emphasis on promoting the Irish language as part of the education system. And this led to the sciences getting less emphasis as a result, because if you have more classes on the Irish language, something has to give. It's estimated that between 1936 and 1971, no students in Ireland were taught any information at all about the environment. There was less emphasis on the sciences, less emphasis on subjects like biology. The big change that occurred in 1971 was that biology became a Leaving Cert subject for the first time. So a lot of people who did their secondary school education between the 1930s and the early 1970s, a lot of people in these generations would have had little or no education about the environment, and as such, little or no appreciation for environmental problems and environmental issues. It's estimated that many of the people who held real positions of power in the period leading up to the early 2000s, and people who generally hold positions of power in departments tend to be in their 50s and 60s. People like senior civil servants, city managers, county managers, as well as politicians. Many of the people who really held real positions of power up until probably the early 2000s, many of these people had gone through their education career with little or no education on the environment, or little or no education in biology. And the geography programs, to be honest, during this period really weren't looking at the environment too much either. So you had this problem in Ireland up until probably, I'd say, the late 2000s, 2010s, that many of the decision makers really hadn't had any exposure to environmental education as they were working through their school careers. And as such, as I said, no real understanding of the environment, and perhaps no real kind of sympathy towards environmental issues as well as a result of this. Okay, everyone, so that's this week's set of lectures. I will be putting up an in-class exercise relating to this week's lectures. Not an in-class exercise, an online exercise. I'll give you a few days to do that, but basically what you have to do for that, listen to this lecture. If you've got to the end of this, you've that done already, and then answer the question. The question I'll set you will be a question that will be, it'll be like what you get to do in class. It's something that you could do in about 20 minutes, very short answer. I'll probably ask you to critically assess the statement and basically make 3 or 4 main points or arguments, back up that argument, explain your argument, back up your point, roughly about 5 or 6 lines for each of the 3 or 4 main points or arguments that you make. And try and be critical as well. So what I mean by being critical, I don't mean criticize. Try to be critical. Try to look at the pros and cons of an issue or a topic. So if you're being asked to be critical, give 3 or 4 main points. Maybe 2 or 3 of the main points can be pros, arguments in favor of a statement or in favor of a topic, and another 1 or 2 or 3 main points or arguments can be cons, arguments against a statement or arguments against a particular topic, etc. Hopefully you get that point anyway. Anyway, that's it for this lecture.